My name is Kendra Copeland. This is my legal rights and responsibilities presentation. The main topic of this presentation is going to be to just discuss the legal rights that teachers, students, and parents have when it comes to children with special needs. And I included a lot of slides on just IDEA and some of the other little things that went with it that I thought were important. And I covered the different kind of referrals, like how a referral works and stuff like that as well. So let's just go forward here. To define special education, I found this online at a different, like a special education website. It says special education can be defined as a form of learning provided to students with exceptional needs, such as students with learning disabilities or mental challenges. When I think of special education, I think just, like, I understand that's the legal definition, but when I think about it, I think about how it's really a more tailored service to those students that need that kind of different instruction, because things that a special education teacher would know about how to implement things with students who have issues with motor skills but need to learn how to write their names and stuff can also be used for students who in the general education classroom have an issue with what's the word I'm looking for? Just like convincing themselves to write. Like my godson hates to hold a pencil. He just doesn't like the way it feels, and I've had a special education teacher kind of explain to me what she did to get it going and how that helped, and we've implemented that, and he's gotten more accustomed to using the pencil and a little bit more interested in it and the pressure and stuff. So I just think special education is just a more kind of tailored form of education that fits specific needs instead of generalized needs. Okay, so IDEA is considered like the Bill of Rights for children with exceptionalities. The purpose was to ensure that all handicapped children have available to them a free public education, which emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs, to ensure that the rights of handicapped children and their parents and guardians are protected, to assist states and locales to provide for the education of all handicapped children, and to assess and assure the effectiveness of efforts to educate handicapped children. For that definition, I really didn't like the use of the word handicapped, but it did come directly from the book, so that's why it's here. Just overview and all this is kind of the way I look at IDEA, is that it's kind of the building block and foundation for what really got children into the education system and out of those really crappy asylums that didn't do anybody any good. And I just think, in all rights considered, it's definitely the most important thing that we as educators, whether you're doing special education or not, definitely need to know. Okay, sorry. I was checking something. There are 6 principles to IEDA, which is, the first one is a free, appropriate public education. So all children, regardless of the severity of their disability, must be provided with appropriate education. I think that that's very important, because if you read back in chapter 2 of our book, you'll see that the cases said a lot. There was one child I was reading that was completely denied from going to high school because of their parents with their physical disability made teachers sick. Like, I read that in the book, and so the zero reject policy was definitely, philosophy was definitely a big stepping stone in there. Included in this principle is the concept of related services, which requires that children receive, for example, occupational therapy as well as other services as necessary in order to benefit from special education, and that these, in this principle, I think it's in this principle, that these services are free to the parents as well, because a lot of parents and guardians, at no cost to parents and guardians, so yeah, definitely free. The LRE, the least restrictive learning environment, is where children with disabilities are to be educated to the maximum extent appropriate with students without disabilities. Placement must be consistent with the pupil's educational needs, which of course is a big entrance into inclusion, which I'm a big believer in. I think that all children strive from each other. I mean, children without disabilities learn from children with disabilities how to be resilient and how to overcome obstacles, whereas the children with disabilities learn from the typically developing children, you know, what's the appropriate way to hold a pencil, or what's the appropriate behavior in this situation. So they learn back and forth from each other, and inclusion really does help make that environment the least restrictive to everyone. When I also think of this principle, I think of, you know, if they're in the least restrictive environment, then the educator that is in that environment needs to be one who is accepting of children with disabilities and is actually interested in teaching these children with disabilities, and not just to have them, like, I remember when I was little, we had a kid with Down syndrome that would come in our class every so often. And every time he would leave, our teacher, she hated him coming in there. She hated having him. So I just remember that. And so when I think of the least restrictive environment, it's, you know, to reach their maximum potential, they need to be somewhere where someone is willing to help them do that and doesn't just think, oh, well, we'll just sweep them under the rug and let it go. So loud at my house. The Individualized Education Program, IEP, is the document that is made with parents, guardians, principal, teacher, special education teacher, therapist, counselor, anyone and everyone, and it's tailored to the student, their like what they need to learn and how they learn with their exceptionalities. The first thing within it is to address the present level of academic functioning, so where they're at within the school or learning. The annual goals and accompanying instruction objectives, educational services to be provided, the degree to which the pupil will be able to participate in general education programs, plans for initiating services and length of service delivery, and an annual evaluation procedure specifying objective criteria to determine if instructional objectives are being met. I actually, in my pre-1, got to sit in an IEP meeting. It was a kind of pre-meeting. It was the pre-meeting before they met with the parent. So what it was they had several different students that were up to get their IEP evaluated, at least, I believe, 3. And so they had the principal, the counselor, the special education, both the special education teachers, and then they had the general education teacher that was actually, the kid was in inclusion and was being pulled out to go to special education. And so my teacher was one of the teachers that was there for that pre-IEP meeting, and they discussed some of this stuff. If he was meeting the goals, if they thought that he was doing well enough being inclusion, or if he needed to go to full-blown special education for a couple months to see if that helped him or what, and what they were going to discuss after they come up with this whole thing, how they were going to discuss it with the parent before the parent came. That way they kind of had a pre-meeting, and they were all on the same page, so it wasn't a big confusing thing. And they did that with every one of their IEPs. They just did a pre-meeting with the staff of the school, and then they did a full meeting, a real full meeting with the teacher, or the mom, or the dad, and the student, if the student needed to be there. Procedural due process. This act gives parents or guardians several safeguards as it pertains to their child's education. They have the right to request records, the right for those records to they have the right to examine them, the right for them to be confidential, your right to obtain an independent evaluation outside of what they've received through the school, to receive written notifications in their native language of proposed changes to their child's education, classification, or placement, and to an impartial hearing whenever disagreements arise regarding the plans for their son and daughter. They also have the right to be represented by legal counsel. Sorry. At the little pre-IEP meeting, they did discuss how the parent of that particular child did not feel that their child was receiving what they were supposed to through their IEP, but the actual issue was with the parent not complying with what the child needed to be doing at home. And so she had actually been taking steps to get an independent evaluation because she felt like the school was wronging her. But from the position in which I saw it, it was more that the parents expected, which is kind of a scary thing when it comes to an IEP, because it seems like some parents don't think that they have to be a part of it, and it just seemed like it was the parents' issue with the way the school was handling it. But honestly, it was just something a little off. But she was seeking an individual evaluation, and when they were telling me that when they did that, they bring it in with the records and they go over what that person talked about, and sometimes they can get that therapist or that doctor to write a note to whomever, or to actually talk on the phone with the principal or something and be involved in the actual meeting. Non-discriminatory assessment is prior to placement. A child must be evaluated by a multidisciplinary team in all areas of subjected disability by tests that are not racially, culturally, or linguistically based. Students are to receive several types of assessment administered by trained personnel. A single evaluation procedure is not permitted for either planning or placement purposes. I just kind of took that one as you can't just base your assessment off of one thing. Like, you can't say, oh, I went and checked out little Timmy and I think he has a learning disability, but you only looked at him one time and that day wasn't his best day when reading. So you have to do several, and they have to be, not racially, culturally, or linguistically based, so you can get a good administered assessment. Parental participation mandates meaningful parent involvement, sometimes referred to as the Parents' Law. This legislation requires that parents participate fully in the decision-making process that affects their child's education. I think that that is a very important principle, because like I said before, some parents think that, oh, well, we have the IEP set up and that's all. Like, no, there's, along with the decisions that affect your child's education, you have to be willing to, do that too on the at home with your child, whatever is necessary. You have to be involved in the meetings, be involved in their school, be involved with their teachers, and I think that that's an important aspect. Something I thought was important to include was that the IDEA was revised in 2004, and it increased the focus of special education from simply ensuring access to education to improving the educational performance of students with disabilities and aligning special education services with the larger national school improvement efforts that include standard assessment and accountability. So greater conformity to the No Child Left Behind Act, which I will discuss in a minute. I felt like going with the No Child Left Behind Act, this kind of pulled into making those students with disabilities, putting them into where they can take the standardized test and they can be part of those big assessments that the general education classes are, and that they can show, because there are kids that have Down syndrome that are so good at math, whiz kids at math, but if you never let them perform those skills, then you never know it. And so I thought that was important to include. In the educational laws and responsibilities, I put in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is known as the No Child Left Behind. George W. Bush committed to educational reform and accountability by doing this, and the law pretty much reveals that eventually all pupils, including those in special education, are expected to demonstrate proficiency in mathematics, reading, and science. Annual testing of children in 3rd grade through 8th grade is required, with students in grades 10th through 12 assessed at least once. And like I said, I thought that was important because it just it doesn't do the whole, these children have special needs, so obviously they're not going to be any good at these things. You know, it gives them the chance to shine if they're really good at reading, or to shine if they're really good at science, and to actually participate and to be considered. I think that doing the assessments and letting the children, even in the special education classroom, letting them participate in those standardized tests actually really does put them where they're up there with their peers. You're not shortchanging them and saying, oh, they can't do this test because they're in the special education class and they don't do the same stuff that these normal education classes do. And that's not true. Because the law is concerned with the achievement of all students, test scores must be disgraded according to the pupil's disability, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, and English language ability. The anticipated benefit of this requirement is that assessment results will directly translate into instructional accommodations, further aligning special education and general education in a unified delivery system responsible for serving all learners. So the overall goal of it is to help just improve education through these standardized testings and see where things are not going the way that they should be and how to improve that for future reference. On this slide, I included the key components of the different additives into the IDEA from our book, because I really liked the way this was put in the book, the way it was displayed and everything, and how it tells you, this is public law and it mandated this. So I think that it was important to know these public laws and where they became more and more important. If you look in 1986, they're just getting where they're mandating service for preschoolers with disabilities ages 3 through 5, permitting early intervention services for infants and toddlers from birth to 2, individualized family plans established for infants and toddlers, and developmental delay label created. So just in 1986, we're getting the ball running on educating children with disabilities earlier. So we can go start it when they're really young, where they're learning the best and it's going to make the most impact, and it'll help them further through their education. In 1990, they changed the name of the legislation to IDEA. Autism and traumatic brain injury identified as discrete disability categories. Rehabilitation, counseling, and social work considered related services. So having those services were considered related. Establishing the requirement of an individualized transition plan by age 16, and states' immunity from lawsuits for violating IDEA repealed. So again, that was another big stepping stone in making sure that IDEA was followed, making sure that children were able to transition from school, special education, into the real world, etc. And then in 1997, students with disabilities are required to participate in state and district-wide assessments. Transition planning commences at age 14. Orientation and mobility included as a related service. Discretionary use of developmentally delayed label for pupils 3 through 9. I think that that's important because just what we did in the last couple weeks about labeling and how it impacts a student and how it defines a student by their disability and not by them. Like, you're not thinking of the child if you're defining them by their disability. General educators required to participate in the IEP team. That's important because it's getting closer to inclusion and making that more of an important thing. Students with disabilities are to be involved in and have access to general education curriculum, which is definitely important. Meditation offered as a means of resolving disputes. I think that is a very interesting concept to add. Benchmarks and measurable annual goals emphasized. I think that's important because if you're looking at these annual goals and a student's not progressing with what you are doing, then you do need to change it up, and you need to be able to look back at that and say, okay, well, this method isn't working. Pupils who violate student code of conduct may be removed from their current educational placement only after due process hearing. I think that's important. I mean, you can't just say, well, that child has disabilities, so we'll have to let them get away with whatever and go on. It's important that everyone be held accountable to the same standards. If you're bullying or misbehaving, then you need to be held accountable. Assistive technology needs of each learner must be assessed. I think that's very important, especially coming from having a godson with autism that for a long time didn't talk. Or I take care of a young boy with Down syndrome and autism, and once his autism started showing, he point blank just stopped all kind of communication. But on his iPad that he has at school, and then he has one at home, he can choose, and his mom is great and does a bunch of different has a bunch of different technology where he can pick what he's trying to say to you, so you can understand him, and I think that's very important. Students expelled or suspended from school are still entitled to receive services in accordance with their IEP. I think that is so important. I mean, these services are not just like, we're going to school or we're playing football or whatever. They're, these kids need this therapy even if they do make bad decisions and get expelled. Greater variety of assessment tools and strategies are permissible for initial evaluations and revelations. I think that is also important because if you limit the ways we can assess, not all children fit into these pre-cookie cutter categories of where this kind of assessment is going to tell you everything you need to know. You need to be able to mix it up. So just a recap to the rights of the students is the right to a free, appropriate public education, access to the least restrictive learning environment, individualized education plans or the IEPs, non-discriminatory assessments, not based on their culture or anything like that. And then I thought that it was kind of important to include that they do have the right of their parents being involved. Like, their parents need to be involved in their education. Rights of the parents are no cost of an appropriate education that meets the unique needs of their child, such as the need for therapy or speech therapy, physical therapy, things that can be offered by the school. The right to be present during and help with the creation of an IEP. That's very important because they need to know and need to be able to add in, well, my child can do this at home even if they're not doing it for you, and this is how we do it, and help. Confidentiality of records, to examine all records and to obtain an independent evaluation. Those are all very important. And then to receive written notification in their native language of proposed changes to the child's educational classification or placement, which is also important because not all parents are, English speaking, and so it's important to have that. Also, I know that at an IEP meeting, they would have someone that would help tell them in their native language what was being said and what was being discussed. And then the rights of the teachers is to have a team of professionals to assist them, which includes a special education teacher, general education teacher, principal, therapist, superintendent, counselor. At the IEP meeting I went into, the counselor was there, the principal was there, special education teacher, general education teacher, myself, a counselor, student, and there was another person. There was someone actually transcribing everything they said. So, and then they have professional involvement in creating the child's IEP, along with having the help of others to bring in with them. And then the teachers also have the rights of parents' participation, because parents are supposed to participate in everything that goes on. I thought it was important to include the different type of reporting in order to decide if a child needs special education services. So the first one is pre-referral intervention. This is instructional or behavioral strategies introduced by the general educator to assist the students experiencing difficulty, and they're designed to minimize inappropriate referrals for special education. This is to kind of the pre-thing. It occurs before initiating a real referral, so they can see, does this student really need special education services, or can they benefit from some strategies that I can implement for the whole class and be just fine. That way they reduce unwanted referrals when providing individualized assistance to students who would benefit without special education. So you have to try those strategies first to see. And then after that, you would go on to the next one, which is a referral, which is a formal request by a teacher or parent that a student be evaluated for special education services. This is the first step toward receiving special education. It's a written request to evaluate the student to determine whether the child has a disability. Typically, it begins with the general education or the general educator. It may also be initiated by a school administrator, a relative service provider, a concerned parent, another individual. Referrals typically arise from a concern about a child's academic achievement and or social behavioral problems. With my godson, we actually got referrals for everything through our doctor because he saw that what we saw with the issues of him having autism and showing the characteristics and the signs. And so he said, okay, well, first we're going to try speech therapy. And so here's a referral. And then next we're going to try occupational. And then next we're going to try physical. And all these different therapies. There was a good, from the time he was 2 to the time he was 4, that he did not talk because autism kicked in. He would come and show you what he wanted, but he completely went mute and nonverbal. And then even after he started speech therapy, he would go days without talking. Days. And so, but now, after we had these first step referrals and got everything situated, he will now not, like, everything, he talks your ear off, tells you all kinds of stories. So definitely living proof of the referral system. And then assessment is the process of gathering information and identifying a student's strengths and needs through a variety of instruments and products, data used in making decisions. One of the goals of the assessment process is to obtain a complete profile of the student's abilities and his or her needs. By law, IDEA requires the use of a multidisciplinary team, of which one member must be a teacher, and then the multidisciplinary team is a group of professionals from different disciplines who function as a team but perform their roles independently from one another. My idea of assessment is just, you know that the child needs help, and now you're going to look at, well, what are they having those issues with? Not that they're weaknesses, but they're just, there's a really good word for it that I love to use over weakness, but I can't think of it. Right now all I can think of is limitations, but taking those limitations they have and those strengths they have and then seeing what we can do to build on it is the whole point of assessment. Impact to my future classroom is that my dream is to become basically a teacher who has an inclusion classroom. I mean, my goal is to not just have one child who's included in the general education, but to split it right down the middle and give me 50 kids who are like 50%, not 50 kids, I don't need 100 kids, 50% of the kids that are special educated need that special education, and then 50% that don't. And having this classroom now, ideally I want to teach 3-year-olds, so it's a little more of a thing that I can accomplish because of the way that it's going to work. But after I finish my associate's or my bachelor's degree, I want to get my master's in special education so I can be an inclusion teacher. For lack of better words, this impacts my future classroom because these laws and responsibilities are important, and it'll be important for me to know them so I can be a part of IEPs and so on, and that I'll also be able to educate parents that come in that aren't so sure about it. And then this assignment has impacted my future classroom because it's helped me to better understand the rules and regulations and everything. I didn't finish that there, but that was the thought. My philosophy, my overall belief is that you should teach a child based on their individual strengths and the things that they're interested in. And you should not label their weaknesses. Their challenges is the word. Strengths and challenges is the way I like to look at it, because I have my own issues with having cerebral palsy in my ankles and wearing braces and all that when I was young. And, I remember being in PE, and instead of having me take my braces off and participate, it was like, oh, you can sit out. And so everyone was mad at me because I was getting to sit out. And so I think that it's important to include everyone, even if you don't think they can do it, and to make it to where they can participate too, because other students are either going to think, wow, they're really lucky, or wow, I'm really jealous. My plan for my future classroom is to create an environment that welcomes all students and their families. And I'm talking even English language learners, anybody. I know a little bit of sign language. I'm willing to learn some Spanish. I'm willing to put it all over my classroom, labels, everything, so they can learn the words and use the other words. If there is a Spanish-speaking child in our classroom, we'll use the words, and because the kids like to learn that stuff. And then I plan, just for my kind of teaching style, to just allow my students to explore and discover with me there, and then I'll provide scaffolding if they have difficulties and help them go forward. That's the end of my presentation.